Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this week's video, I'm going to be going through the work I've done so far for my Masters of Architecture final design project and show you guys what's left. So without further ado, let's get into it. So to start, I call the project Resurgence of the Piave, and it's a compositional orchestration between architecture and the landscape. And this is the PDF that I showed, or this presentation that I showed for my interim review a couple weeks ago. And I said it to kind of my tutors and the head of school as well, is that it's important not to kind of skip over this and give like a brief summary, so I'm going to read it through for you guys as well. So it's the objective of my scheme is to bring fresh water and sediment from the river Sile into the lagoon. The condition of the lagoon and the health of the ecosystem depends on the influx of sediment and fresh water. Therefore, it is crucial to design a highly sophisticated and well-orchestrated architectural scheme to perform these actions. The client for the project are the citizens of Venice, to bring the Venetian people together to work on conserving and restoring their lagoon. The clients also extend to fish farmers that live and work on the lagoon. The designated site is within the Venice Lagoon near the village of Capusile in the municipality of San Donade Piave, with the river Sile bordering the land and lagoon. In order to combat the rise in sea level, it is time for the profession to create interventions which respond to climate change threats. My project aims to incorporate a combination of engineering and science to create an architectural intervention that meets the needs of the clients and, most importantly, the health of the lagoon. An architectural rehabilitation intervention that will restore the ecosystem of the Venice Lagoon. So this is some of the stuff that I think I've shown you guys before, being like a much more zoomed out map of Italy, highlighting Venice and in specifics Capusile, which my site is based, and some of the kind of the marine life and species that are kind of located within the lagoon itself. And something that I wanted to include at the beginning of the presentation is some kind of newspaper articles that relate strongly to my topic. So things such as In Saving Venice, Floating City, Lagoon in Peril, To Survive Climate Change, Venice needs to rethink its outdated flood defences and things like that, because one of the flood defences that Venice uses is the Mose system, but over time, and as I've explained in previous videos, like there's lots of things such as political corruption that happened and went on with that kind of scheme that ultimately isn't really even a long-term solution, and they spent so much money and so much money was lost during that whole process. So it's kind of up to architects and engineers right now to think of ways of providing these solutions. And again, kind of looking at newspaper articles and kind of the relationship between nature and human health, having what are blue spaces and how can they benefit mental health. Or else we've got experiment reveals what 1 hour in nature does to the human brain, and time spent in blue faces benefits children in later life from studies and things like that. And I kind of broke down my initial, I don't know how to kind of say this, but like kind of initial objectives that I wanted to think about, and one of them being the rising temperature and structural stability, flood zones, extreme low temperature areas, and climate change, and how that will impact the designs of buildings. So these four things, ranging from things such as social, economic, environmental, and within that is a strong kind of thread of sustainability that needs to be apparent, and not just in this scheme but in every single scheme moving forward in the future. And again, this kind of gets extended to things such as not using motorboats within the lagoon, reducing noise pollution, recollecting all the trash and remains from picnics, volunteering to work with the marine life, reducing plastic usage, becoming a responsible traveller. So things to bear in mind for guests coming to the scheme, and not even just guests but also citizens and kind of residents of the area as well. Conserving water and reducing runoff, and of course reducing your carbon footprint. And the reduction in carbon footprint also tracks back to the development of the scheme itself and how it's going to be constructed, the materials coming in, the transportation that requires, but then also trying to translate that and transfer that into how reducing a carbon footprint for visitors as well who are going to be coming to the scheme. Again, some more kind of illustrations. The one on the left found from a report similar to the map earlier I showed, and the one on the right is kind of a collage I made. The top half shows like the Rhino model that we were given in studio, and this is more of the bathymetrics. So if I'm not wrong, it's the topography under the water, beneath the water. So it kind of shows the level of the ground beneath the water of the lagoon of Venice, the Venice Lagoon. And then the bottom half of the image on the right shows the different soil and the land types. And unfortunately this one's missing the captions that I've already added to it, I don't know why. and the LiDAR scan. And I quite like this LiDAR scan because yes, it's very informative and analytical, but aesthetically as well. I think this year, I don't know what's happened, but I've really become in touch with black and white and kind of grayscale visualization. So kind of having this theme run through the project, I think it's quite nice. And obviously now with a month to go until the final submission, when it comes to creating that final portfolio, it's something that's going to be kind of a strong identity within my work. Yeah, again, some work that I think I've already shown you guys, being the elevation profile, and I quite liked creating these collages because they're both very analytical, but at the same time the representation of it, I think it's quite nice, and pinpointing the location of where these kind of the high points and low points of the river are is quite important. Nature as a web of relations, so I wanted to create this kind of this page effectively to show kind of the journey that the water goes through from the very top to all the way down to the very bottom, and how do I say this? Not that I've already said the journey, but kind of the route that it takes. And because we can see on the right hand side from the mountains at the top coming down into these braided rivers that we can see as so much sediment is deposited there. And for my project, it's extremely important to kind of straighten and narrow down these channels that we see in the middle image, because that will be carrying much more sediment down to my site, which effectively bringing more fresh water, bringing more sediment enables a greater improvement for the health of the lagoon, which is vital. So I wanted to do some very initial collages of what could happen. I mean, it says further development, but these collages are very kind of initial. How is it working to create a language between the land and the water? Do they work in harmony, or are they going to be separate? And it's something that earlier on I just wanted to test out just to see what happens. And again, we see previously how it's kind of a connection, and although the scale is completely ridiculous and it's so big, it's just kind of testing this idea and testing this notion of bridging the gap. However, we see in these ones now that the lines have been, sorry, not the lines, the language has been kind of completely reversed, and it's something that's kind of piercing and directly kind of attacking the land, but we see the growth coming from it. So could it be something like that I take forward with me? Some of the things that I was thinking about. And again, having that stretch, the one on the left being a bit more, actually the one on the right being much more successful, because we still see some tangents coming up from the land. Could these be connections? Could these be bridges? So we're not thinking architecturally yet, we're thinking in I'm thinking in an artistic way to kind of express the ideas that I had for later on to then translate those architecturally. And yeah, going back to kind of newspaper articles, going back to facts and statistics, it says that rivers are a surprisingly large source of greenhouse gases, and water pollution makes their emissions many times worse. And this is definitely something that as soon as I was working so hard to produce a scheme that works with the river, with the lagoon, and architecturally, being the programs and the functions that I wanted the building to have. But then as soon as I saw this, I was like, oh no, maybe it's not such a good idea to do this. But then after having a couple studio sessions with my tutors, they were like, well, if anything, this is perfect, because this then means that the scheme is going to be embodying the lagoon. It's going to be embedded within the landscape itself. And being as our studio is an architecture and landscape studio, this just seemed like the perfect fit. It wasn't an accident, but it was something that just comes from these conversations. And the more research that I was doing, the more that I found out, I was like, everything seems to be kind of attaching to one another and kind of working to build up my narrative, which I quite enjoyed. And again, these are some more theoretical collages that I was creating. So we have this one and the next one, but this one was more particle simulation. So I've never used Houdini before, but I wanted to try it out to see what I could produce. And I was kind of amazed at some of the forms that the simulation made once I kind of put in some commands. And this was the most successful collage that has come from this project, because everything up from this collage up to now has been influenced by this image. It's two different languages, it's two different kind of conversations that are happening, but they are joined together. And later on, as the project developed, this kind of became into two things. The one on the left, as we can see, kind of this wing. This has been kind of translated architecturally through Weirs, and in this video I'm going to be going on to show you kind of what I've been able to produce from this collage and how it's been influenced. And the one on the right being a space for the building itself. And I can see kind of where it's been influenced in this collage to now, but if I was to kind of think of it the other way around, I don't think it would have worked. So it was quite nice that I was able to create these collages without restricting myself too much. And looking at the river restoration handbook that one of my tutors showed me and told me to go through them, finding out different techniques, and one of those techniques being the weirs that I can be now implementing in my scheme, and it just works very, very well. Again, looking at locks, weirs and barriers. Kind of a landscape restoration, going back to the river restoration manual and finding these points, increasing the stream flow, straightening the channels and the meanders, implementing water control points and these undershot weirs, riffle beds. And the weirs and the riffle beds is something that's now kind of the main landscape design that I've been doing. Looking at old maps, old cartography of the river, and understanding the old Piave, and it's kind of creating a phantom, because working with the notion of the Piave being a part of the building is like the river is there, but it's not there, because the old Piave was like this main river that I believe was very significant, especially during the war. I'm not sure which war, but I do know, but it's just not written, so I can't remember now. But it was such a pivotal form of landscape and nature during those times that it's been lost over time, and it's been kind of redirected. So my project, being the resurgence of the Piave, is to create this phantom effect, is that the river is there, and it's been a guide, it's been a route that has influenced the structure, it's influenced the design of my building, but the river isn't there. So it's playing with this kind of notion. And just to go back to that, I think the surrounding site as well has greatly influenced the project, because they all work in harmony. We're kind of talking about decades, and not even just going back decades, but centuries, and how the land and how the landscape has evolved over time, and how I've been able to kind of, well, obviously with the support of tutors, to dig into more research, and there's also been other guests, professors that we've had that have spoken about the lagoon in much more depth, that's supported my project. I think it works in a great harmony right now, that everything, again, as I've said before, just adds to build this narrative up that effectively can work towards kind of this sophisticated outcome. Retracing that wing, and then also tracing the Piave, just so as I trace it, what is coming to my mind as I do it, because it's very easy just to look at the image and kind of put it aside. But once I'm retracing it, does that then also add to the work that I've done previously? And then how can I kind of layer these things on top of each other and look at it from a different perspective? And the sediment bed and the skeleton form, I kind of wanted to read out this section because it's very important, and it's going to be a bit more like kind of sciencey, geographical kind of some notes. But it was very important for me to understand this process, because it's what's going to be happening as the water comes down from the river and enters the lagoon. So architecturally and aesthetically, I have more opportunity to work with the sediment lagoons and the concentration strategy, because that gives me program that is expansive across the landing zone for the water. I'm taking water out from the lowest level of the Piave bed because I want to carry the sediment with it. I'm then agitating it to oxygenate it, and then some can be diverted to generate hydropower, which, as we know, I'm not doing that anymore. But at this rate, the sediment is fully entrained into the water column. And once it's out of the riffles that oxygenate it, or out of the hydropower turbine, which isn't there anymore, I need to slow down the rate of the water, because it's only when the water is moving slowly that the sediment, as I explained earlier, will then fall out of the water column. And this will be further exacerbated if the water goes as far as the brackish water, with the mixture of the salt water and the fresh water to start a process called flocculation, where the sediment will drop out. Some river restoration, fluvial phenomenology, having these riffle beds, embedding them into my scheme. This works with the implementation of the weirs that I've already designed, I'm going to be showing you guys. And again, this is just some more programs, some more information that you've seen with the drawings, the program formation, some of the precedents that kind of helped me along the way, and kind of the diagrams I've shown in previous videos, and how I'm going to be embedding that into the landscape. Influence from other architects, especially Gehry, And this project in particular with the LV Foundation is something that's been so significant to my project, that I'm going to be kind of showing you how I've been able to kind of take apart the LV Foundation and think of it in terms of different structures and different elements that have helped me to really kind of produce an architectural outcome. Because when it came to the final, well, I'll show you guys, but when it came to the end of this interim review, it became clear that the form that I made, it would have been so complicated and would have taken so much time, and architecturally and engineering wise it may not have even worked. But by breaking it down into different sections, and I'm going to be showing you some of the diagrams and illustrations I made, I was able to rethink the project, keep the same narrative, but architecturally expand on how it can be constructed. So playing with these collages again, breaking it down into different zones of diagrams. The initial form that I made was this one, and then slicing the volumes to see how they look. And then I called it the sushi section. So the initial form that I made on Rhino, breaking that up and kind of exploding it and seeing like what are these different, how are the volumes, how are the spaces, what do they look like. And then I called it the sushi section because I thought if I just create another illustration, it could look quite nice. And I think this was quite successful because yes, I did it for an aesthetic reason for, this one, but previously for this, when I'm breaking up the volume and we see different forms, my tutor then said, after conversations about the LV Foundation, think of your envelope like you did the sushi section. Break it up. Can we create these voids? Can we create the spaces? Where do we want coverage? Where do we not want the coverage? How is this influencing people's experiences as they're not only going through the building, but as they're experiencing the building as a whole from the outside in, and also their access to it? So that was also quite challenging for me to wrap my head around, because splitting up the envelope, because usually we just believe that we're creating the forms and we use the envelope to wrap the building. But then as I'm thinking about exploding the envelope and wrapping it around the form that I've already got, or the different forms that I have, that was something that was really, really challenging. And these were some initial interiors collages that I made. So the previous one, we've got the lobby, got the museum, the research center, the water and sediment monitoring lab, underwater observatory, auditorium, education hub, and then these are the pictures of the models that kind of ended the presentation there. So we've got the model on the left, which is the model you've seen me make in the previous video, and on the right I've added the 3D model, which we can see is the one that I showed in the previous pages just now, that I made in Rhino and then sent that to the university workshop to get 3D printed. And finishing the presentation off now with these final views of the 3D model on the site model, and it worked quite nicely as an initial form, and it worked with the narrative. But again, and I think this is the great comments that I got from the interim review was, okay, now let's break this down into an architectural scheme. Because right now, yes, it does look like a building. Yes, it looks like kind of something that Zaha Hadid architects could produce and could make, but it would have been just extremely complicated, and there would have been so many more challenges structurally that I just wouldn't have had the time to kind of resolve. So breaking that down into something that's much more structured and able to be constructed within this site as well, within the lagoon, is something I had to work on for the following weeks, which I have done. So I'm going to show you that to you guys now. So as we can see from the kind of the Photoshop files that I've opened now of the forms that I've created, it's much different than the final volume that I showed you on the site model. I took the programs that I'm creating and I put them into separate blocks that would be much more easily constructed. And kind of the influence that I took from this was the LV Foundation by Gary, because he used he used this technique of create the concrete blocks, create the programs that you want, and then build around that. So that's exactly what I've tried to emulate through my project and take great influence by. And we can also see the sediment pools here and the weirs, so kind of placing those within the model as well to give a greater perception of the reality that I wanted to produce. And from that, again, look at the fish ladders as well, which was another landscape kind of intervention that I wanted to implement in my scheme after speaking with my tutors. These white kind of icebergs, if you will, are purely there to support the wrapping of the envelope that I'm going to be producing. And it wasn't until I kind of studied the LV Foundation in great depth to understand that not necessarily in architecture you have to design forms to be as kind of how do you say it, to create these kind of these outlandish and exciting forms. They don't need to physically and literally be as you say. You can play with the perception of them, and you can play with people's eyes and how you want them to see it, because when you look at the LV Foundation, you're like, wow, this is quite extraordinary how he's been able to produce these forms, how these curves are able to be supported. But it's only until you literally unwrap the whole building and see it as different segments and different sections that you will truly then be able to understand, and that I've been able to understand to then emulate that style within this project, and it just works beautifully. So using these icebergs for structural support of the wrapping, and then testing out some initial forms of how I can create these curves for the wrapping of the envelope. We can also see that I've been adding the columns to support some of the structures that I've made, bringing the promenade forward, and then having to later on changing the staircases in order to bring these landscape elements closer, to not have that a greater disconnect, raising also the residential block as well. And then again, more testing with the envelope, kind of this translucent, this transparent kind of skin. This was less successful, because as my tutor says, it looks like pieces of lasagna sheets, and yeah, fair enough, like they do. So this was much less successful. But then and then you can see here as well, playing with the weirs. So initially they came up to here, but then extending them out so they're much more embedded, and this structure and this grid is connecting both the architecture with the landscape. Yeah. And the next one was to look back at the Gehry, look back at how am I able to really understand my narrative, and how am I able to emulate and respect the work of existing architecture to apply to my project. And this wrapping was much more successful. This wrapping creates a body and a skin that actually creates a greater sub-ecosystem within the lagoon itself. And it's only until then that you realize, or that I realize, that this project is much more fragile and delicate than I initially thought it could be. So we see more wrapping. This is kind of the final test that I did, or is the next one? Yeah, this one. The final test is much more successful. And although right now we see it as kind of white solid blocks, this will be kind of a transparent skin that will be wrapping the form, or forms are. Zoomed out version, and we see the introduction of the bridge that I've placed into the scheme, and how this would be coming from the area where another bridge is on the land, so people accessing through this way. And I wanted to finish off kind of this video and finish off kind of the work that I've done up to now before my tutorial with like an atmospheric kind of perspective drawing or perspective collage, taking that previous JPEG that you saw, that initial kind of V-Ray render, and placing it within the context, adding some fog, adding some atmosphere to it, and seeing how the project could look like, and kind of the next steps, because we see it now with the white solid blocks. As I said already, it's going to change into a much more transparent ETFE type material. But it looks right now, this was a 5-minute collage, but it looks right now that it really does work with the landscape. It is embedded within the lagoon, and I really think that now is kind of the final touches, the final elements in the development process of this wrapping skin process, before I then just have to go on to create the final drawings. And to be honest, the project's done. But it's also about creating amazing perspectives and visuals to really show off, to really place the viewer of this project, whoever wants to look at this project, place them within each of these elements. How are they going to be experiencing the spaces? And I think that's what truly will make this form of architecture quite magical in a way, and very special. So I'm really looking forward to it. And with that, I'd like to say, thank you so much for watching this video if you made it this far. And yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thank you.